Good. Okay, so for my project, I focused on ANZAC nurses in World War One. ANZAC stands for Australian and New Zealand Army Corps. So these were the nurses that came over from Australia and New Zealand to come help in the war. For me, this was a really interesting topic just because in school I never really heard about Australia and New Zealand's importance in the war, and through this I was able to see that they actually contributed a lot of troops and nurses. For my research, I focused a lot on what their roles were as nurses, the innovation within the nursing community, and also how they fought certain gender norms without necessarily that being their goal. Also their conditions, and one thing that I didn't include in here but I thought that was really interesting was their colonial identity as a colony of Britain. So if you have any questions or ideas, please ask.
So I'm curious about the lack of equipment available to them. Do you have an example of a time where they may have substituted something for something else?
So one thing I found in my research is these two pictures up here of the scalpel and sewing kit. A lot of times that would be some of the only resources they have, especially at the dressing stations. Typically with dressings, they would either, if they ran out of dressing or couldn't wash them fast enough, they would just have to start ripping clothes off of each other and start wrapping their arms and legs with that. A lot of times when there weren't enough supplies, they'd have to look around the hospitals to try to find adequate supplies to take care of everybody.
Do you know of any cases where nurses were like specifically attacked by the enemy?
Not that I found. So most of my research came from the diaries of Australian and New Zealand nurses. Within their diaries, they didn't talk a lot about any of the hospitals being attacked. Most of the areas that these women were working in weren't necessarily really close to the battlefields. They would set up hospitals a little farther away, such as in the case of Gallipoli. These nurses that I looked into were at hospitals in Cairo or other parts of the Middle East that were nearby. So they would transport the soldiers to those hospitals they were working at. Other?
I don't know if you said this, but is there anything specific about them being in that area? Like, was there any particular nursing requirements or different wounds or diseases or something that the ANZAC nurses had to deal with that potentially French or German or British nurses wouldn't have had to deal with?
So for each of the ANZAC nurses, they already had to have gone through a specific nursing program within Australia and New Zealand. And then once they got to the battlegrounds, they would have to go through another auxiliary protocol just so they would get used to having to take care of injuries when they're on the battlefield or they're in the hospitals. For the nurses with Australia and New Zealand, they typically tried to stay near where their troops were. So a lot of Australian and New Zealand troops were in Gallipoli. So for a lot of the nurses in Cairo, they dealt with the long hours and the heat. A lot of them dealt with a lot of exhaustion, overheating. So sometimes nurses would be out for a few weeks and they'd have to take care of each other. But for a lot of them, they just come right back to it. But most of them would have to deal with typhoid, paratyphoid, scarlet fever, and pneumonia.
Yeah, I was anticipating like heat stroke and stuff being something that you wouldn't need in Britain, that's for sure.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's really interesting. Thank you.
I know for some other nurses, hypothermia was a bigger issue compared to the Australian and New Zealand nurses. I know if there aren't any burning questions right now, one of the things I wanted to highlight was how these nurses went against some gender norms without even thinking about it. So a lot of them in their free time to decompress would smoke and drink. It wasn't necessarily considered professional, but it was accepted. They would smoke and drink with the soldiers, but typically in day-to-day society, smoking and drinking was only meant for upper class white men. So there was a little bit of backlash from communities when they would hear about these nurses smoking and drinking on the job, but no one stopped them. But they were able to take that back with them, and it became a more welcomed practice. So I think my time is up, unless there's any other questions or.
I was gonna ask, did some of this like combatement of gender norms continue post-war, or did it sort of like subside after it had ended?
It was definitely something that helped move along the women's movement as more and more women continued. This was just another example of women going against typical gender norms. So it definitely did contribute, but it wasn't per se a major thing that changed, but definitely was helpful for the feminist movement. So yes, thank you for listening. Okay, and then next, I think I had Ryan going next.
If you share your screen, can you like go between windows, if that makes sense? It's like prompting me to pick a window.
I'm not sure actually.
Here, I'll just close the other ones.